People will say to me, there are these people online who are obsessed with Inception or obsessed with Memento. They're asking me to comment on that as if I thought that were weird or something. And I'm like, well, I was obsessed with it for years, genuinely obsessed with it, so it doesn't strike me as weird. I had lunch with a successful producer a few years ago, and he was curious about my process. At some point, I said, every film I do, I have to believe that I'm making the best film that's ever been made. He was absolutely shocked by this. It's just never occurred to him that someone would think like that. And that, to me, was truly shocking, because films are really hard to make. I'm not going to say it's the hardest job in the world, but they are all-consuming. So it never occurred to me that people were doing it who weren't trying to make the best film that ever was. Why would you otherwise? Even if it's not going to be the best film that's ever been made, you have to believe that it could be. And this is a passage taken directly from the words of the director Christopher Nolan, captured in the incredible book, The Nolan Variations, the movies, mysteries, and marvels of Christopher Nolan, written by author Tom Schoen. This is the book I read in preparation for this very special episode of Icons. And for those of you who are new here, Icons is a podcast where I dive deep into the process and philosophy behind the great artistic masters. Now, I started with this quote because it was actually the quote that stuck with me and stayed with me long after I first heard it listening to the Founders podcast, which had an episode where the host, David Senra, expertly dissected this book too. And this is an episode that I will link in the description, as I highly recommend it in order to see the director fascinatingly through the lens of an entrepreneur. But this quote stuck out to me because of the unapologetically high standard that Christopher Nolan sets for his own work, by stating that he creates films with the intention not just to make his best film, but the best film that's ever been made. And whether he actually achieves this or not aside, he is demanding a quality of output from himself that he now has to contend with throughout the entire creative process. Now, you could easily argue here that perhaps this higher bar would prevent an artist from having the kind of mental resilience needed to allow for a creative flow, and that this perhaps is a form of perfectionism that can get in the way of progress. And indeed, this has made Nolan less flexible in some regard. He notes this himself in the book about how selective he is now about what he works on. He says, "I've definitely retired from the business of just doing another film for the sake of doing it. I can't do that anymore. I find filming very difficult. I find it totally engaging, but it's an arduous process. There's a lot of strain on family, on personal relationships. It takes a lot of physical strength. So it's got to be great. It's got to be something I love." And this notion, by the way, of his work being a strain on his relationships and families, this is something we'll actually later explore, because it sits as a theme within the heart of so many of his films, like Inception, The Dark Knight, and most prominently, Interstellar. But to me, it seems that Christopher Nolan prevents modesty or the desire to ease up to get in the way of his creative ambitions. And I think it's fair to say that his artistic career has had quite the impact because of this. But again, whether he actually reaches this goal or not seems irrelevant both to us as viewers and to Nolan himself. Instead, it seems that the reward for Nolan is simply the effect it has on the audience. As he notes here in the book, you just pour yourself into making a film. So when it affects someone that way, that is a huge thrill for me. A huge thrill. I feel like I've managed to wrap them up in a way that I try to wrap myself up. It's very likely that if you're listening to this episode, you've been affected by the work of Christopher Nolan at least once before. In fact, he's the kind of director that recruits fans to watch all of his films and be affected multiple times over because of it. Because as a director, his work forms a style and genre all of its own, like the work of Scorsese, Tarantino, or Villeneuve. And it's by dissecting this wonderfully written book, which prominently features quotes from interviews conducted by Tom Schoen with the director himself, that you will begin to understand all these kind of through lines that allow for such an incredible body of work to manifest from this iconic director. And with that, let's begin this episode of Icons, where we'll explore the creative lessons bred from studying the fascinating modern filmmaker Christopher Nolan. And we'll cover many incredible lessons, including how Nolan learns about the role of a director, how he directs actors to express emotional moments for a film, how he came to see music's role in the film in a unique way, how architectural forms inform his work, how Nolan uses the cut to solve problems, his love of ideas and the cinematic form, how the tension of being away from family plays a role in his work, and how Nolan's empire is effectively a family business. And as always, all the art I mentioned throughout the episode is listed in the description, so there's no need to frantically Google everything as you listen to this. Here's the thing, Christopher Nolan, just like Coco Chanel in our episode before him, would note that he is in fact not an artist. And similar to how Chanel perhaps separated herself from such a label in order to remain solely focused on producing practical clothing that could be worn, Nolan makes the differentiation between artist and craftsman in order to properly examine where the desire that someone has to create films actually comes from. He says, "I feel that what I do is based more in artifice and abstraction and theatricality. I feel more like a craftsman than an artist." I'm not saying that with false modesty. Maybe it's the difference between saying you are using it to express something purely personal that comes from inside that you're trying to just get out there, or are you trying to communicate with people to tap into their expectations and their experience. My films are much more about filmmaking than people think. And that's likely because Nolan, like that of Quentin Tarantino, is a lover of films who happens to also make films that people love. Growing up, Nolan watched and became obsessed with a lot of what we would come to know as movie classics. We're talking about 2001: A Space Odyssey, Blade Runner, Alien, and Star Wars. And an interesting side note here is that because his family lived in both the UK and the US, he was able to see films in the cinema both during their first run in the US, then when he traveled back to the UK almost 6 months later, he would be able to watch that same summer release again, but now in the winter, as it's a winter release in the UK. And this was obviously during the days where they would do this as two countries would share the same film reels. But the films to note here would be Alien and Blade Runner, as they have a particular significance to how Nolan discovered what he wanted to do. I can remember this, identifying some tone to the films that was common and not really understanding it and wanting to understand it. Something that almost felt like a sound, a low throbbing, a particular lighting, or an atmosphere to those films that was clearly the same. Then I found what it was. Same director. So totally different story, different writers, different actors, different everything. All the things that as a kid you identify as making films what they are. You think the actors basically make the film up. All those things are different, but there's a connection, and that connection is the director. I remember thinking, that's the job I want. I love this. I've talked about in previous episodes about how the power of exposure is so important in how much it can kind of drive our career decisions. And I think this is likely due to the trait of mimetic desire, which is something really worth looking into because it's almost like us filling our need to have a goal, and we end up copying the desires of those who more overtly express their desire for something. And I can't stress this enough. You know, Christopher Nolan may have begun building the foundations for a completely different kind of career if he didn't become aware of the role of a director like he did here. And it's why I think that there's a tremendous value in the Day of a Life videos that you can find on YouTube that might follow a professional going about their day of work. Even if we're aware of the role or name or label, there's lots of jobs we're not exposed to the inner workings of, sometimes until we actually are a few years into working as one. So a lesson here would be to do your part in exposing the workings of your job to aspiring creators. Have a conversation with someone just graduating and tell them what your job really entails, or make a video on what a day in your life looks like. And on the other end, if you are yet undecided on what form you want your work to take, seek out those who already are doing it and give them a reason to have a conversation with you. For it's this exposure that allows people to connect the dots and start building a vision for themselves and the form their obsessions would manifest itself as, just as Nolan did. So what does Nolan end up doing as a director? Well, whilst we will later explore how he's one of those rare directors who has either written or had a hand in writing all of his movies to date, something interesting I learned from Nolan about the responsibility of a director is the need to guide an actor's performance. One of the best scenes in the incredible space adventure Interstellar, a film that I think is greatly inspired by 2001: A Space Odyssey, by the way. In the scene, there's a moment when Cooper and Brand, who are the astronauts, return to the space station from a water planet, a planet where the gravitational relationship to the black hole near it actually ends up affecting its time, making 1 hour there equal to 7 years back on Earth. And their failure to return quickly results in the passing of 23 Earth years. And obviously this prompts Cooper to immediately visit the room where the astronauts can watch video messages sent to them from their loved ones still on Earth. And in the scene, we see Cooper sit through video messages from his son spanning over those 23 years and watch a very emotional father coming to terms with the lost time. And as the book notes, this is actually a very large looming enemy of many of Nolan's films, time. And it's important to take a moment here to acknowledge this theme, for time steals people away in Nolan's films. In the book, he observes, time is a very emotional issue when you're younger. The young are very nostalgic because they're changing so quickly. Your friends, the people you knew when you were 11 or 12, you have a totally different relationship with them. Everyone's going all kind of ways. Things change so fast, so quickly. I think that when you're in your 20s or 30s, time evens out and you're able to look at it a bit more objectively, a bit more logically. Then, in middle age, it comes back to that obsession with the emotional aspects of time passing, how trapped we are by that. Time is something that we can't really understand, but we feel it. We have a very strong sense of time. It affects us greatly, but we don't know what it is. It's these kind of observations that I think give Nolan's films depth. But as we'll learn, it's also what anchors his directions to his actors. Christopher Nolan talks about directing this powerful scene that involves a father having to experience time, having robbed him of his kids growing up. He speaks here on having to evaluate and direct the degree of emotion displayed during the performance that conveys this, and this is so fascinating. He says, I talked to Matthew McConaughey, who plays Cooper, about it a lot, and the way he wanted to do it was we filmed all of the messages in advance. I didn't want to use visual effects to put them in, but what he wanted to do was to not see them until he shot the scene and started his close-up. What he was doing was right on the edge of being too real because he was experiencing it in a very real way as a father, and I think one of the takes might have actually been beyond it. It's this next part that I love. He says, it's one of the great fascinations I have with acting. I sit there and I watch them eye to eye, not on the monitor, just glancing at the monitor for framing, because it's my job to try and experience it as an audience member, to try and be open to what they're feeling. And there's often a point where they're so raw, so open, that you actually disconnect from them because it's too overwhelming. It's too much, and you feel that you're intruding. And so, part of what you do as a director is to gauge when you're really in sync with the audience. This is so fascinating because, we sometimes think of acting in those kind of huge emotional peaks, the sort of things that might win people Oscars, but Nolan notes that too much emotion conveyed in acting is not good, and that there's something for the director to find, a kind of through line, a balance, something emotional but subtle enough that it invites the audience in. And when I hear this, I think of a few different performances, but one that's interesting is probably that of Ryan Gosling's. Not that he features in any of Christopher Nolan's films, but he's an underrated actor who often is overlooked, perhaps because he's a bit more goofy in his persona in interviews, but watch him in films like First Man or The Place Beyond the Pines, Drive, or even the Blade Runner sequel, and you'll see how he nails this subtle emotionality. It's one that ends up being so inviting and thus relatable that there's actually this hilarious meme of young men who look at these characters portrayed by Ryan Gosling and note how he's playing them on screen. But I love that Christopher Nolan watches his actors' performances with his own eye in order to make the correct evaluation. It's known that on Nolan's sets, there is no video village. It's kind of the term used for a place where, directors and perhaps producers sit behind a monitor and watch the performance as though it's already recorded, but instead he holds the monitor to his side, using it only to check technicalities, trusting his cinematographer, and instead looks at the performance raw with the desire to see how they make him feel. So a lesson here would be to avoid looking at your work within the frame that makes it appear more perfect than it might be. This means, for example, for writers, opt to write simply on a plain document where your flawed words can't hide in the perfect appearance of your website or Medium page. Or for photographers, try and take interesting photographs and see them as they are, before editing, before color grading. Just try and be striking in the rawest form of your work. Another responsibility Nolan assumes more than the average director is that of the musical and sonic component of a film. And whilst he doesn't actually write any of the scores himself, he is very much involved in the entire creation process. And the thing is, with there already being so much to worry about when making a film, and with the caliber of musicians, quite frankly, that Nolan is able to recruit for scoring any of his films, you'd think that he'd quite easily just be able to hand the film over to them and just let them do their thing. Well, in another book that I own, called The Art and Making of the Dark Knight Trilogy, I read that, as it says here, rather than hand over the edited film to the composers and have them write music to the specific beats of the picture, as is the typical process, Christopher Nolan asks that the composer begins by writing musical notions connected to the story. Only later would Nolan take those bits and pieces of music into the editing suite and fit them into the picture. It's a unique approach, one aimed at letting the story drive the musical composition rather than the moment-by-moment musical needs of the movie. And there's a quote here by Nolan. He says, "That way, they would be free to write whatever occurred to them, based on the themes of the story rather than worrying about the specific cuts or action beats in the film." Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard, who scored both Batman Begins and The Dark Knight together, were both very accommodating in working this way, and it was a very productive process. Essentially, it seems to me that Christopher Nolan has a fundamental belief that the music of a film is as important to the story than all of those other parts that he has to worry about. And again, if you're aiming to make the best film ever made, as he is, then you're aiming to tell the best story you possibly can, meaning that you need every component that can contribute to that to be working at their highest level. I think this approach also frees his musical partnerships to explore more ideas as well as do more to help shape the final film, which is why I think Hans Zimmer, Howard, and the others that Nolan has worked with seem to return to him to score film after film with him. Nolan speaks about his relationship specifically with Zimmer in the book when he notes, "Hans was very generous and comfortable with me wanting to get really in there and wrestle with things as part of my process, rather than laying the music over the top. I don't think he's ever been someone who wants to come along with music like a coat of paint at the end. He wants to be deep in the structure of what's going on, and I really took him up on that more and more with each film." But how did Nolan develop this belief in and respect for music in the first place? How did it take equal weight, basically, in his mind to the rest of the filmmaking process? Well, it's likely due to an experience he'd have at the boarding school his parents sent him to growing up. For it was here, hours after the strict bedtimes that the school gave him, that Nolan would find himself listening to scores of his favourite films in the dark. As the book notes, Nolan remembers lying in his bed after lights out, listening to the soundtracks of Star Wars 2001 or Vangelis' score, Chariots of Fire, on his Walkman. Nolan's films have sometimes attracted criticism for the volume of Hans Zimmer's scores, but the all-enveloping union of music and image Nolan is after approximates the level of entombed transport he felt listening to the soundtracks in the dark, while Vangelis's groundbreaking mixture of synthesizer and orchestra in his score provided the model for all the scores that Zimmer would compose for Nolan in the years to come. The amazing thing about reading this section was that I was immediately reminded of how similar an experience I had with movie scores and soundtracks growing up, and it was Star Wars for me too, although the prequel soundtracks, to be fair, of the early 2000s, reimagining the scenes play out in my mind as the soundtrack played very loudly in my mother's car. And my mother would later hilariously note that when we listened to the Star Wars soundtracks, she no longer felt like she was driving a car, but instead driving a spaceship instead. Just goes to show the power of these soundtracks. But it's here that Nolan makes a fascinating observation about the route that we travel in our own minds when having these kind of creative imaginations. He says, "What I see with my kids, just creatively, is that if they have a fascination for something they're interested in, they can follow the train of media, the train of thought, very, very quickly. That wasn't the case for me." And this probably refers to how someone can easily search the internet and instantly get a YouTube video for the thing that they want to see. Whereas Nolan says, we very much had to work for it. The way in which our escapes worked was that you would listen to music and your imagination would have to fill in the blanks. Film scores leave a bit of space to think, more like ambient music, I suppose. I certainly prize the imaginative space of listening to music in the dark, thinking about things, imagining things, film stories. That was very important to me. And I think Nolan is truly onto something important here in terms of creativity. I think there's definitely something to not wanting to find out the answer to something so quickly and so directly, as by doing so, it kind of strips you of a journey that helps you stumble across new ideas. And in one of the best books I've ever read on creativity, written by Anthony Brandt and David Eagleman, a book called The Runaway Species, How Human Creativity Remakes the World, the writers note the importance for us to get off the path of least resistance. That this easy path, whilst extremely desirable for the brain and having been reinforced due to the necessity to think and act quickly, is the worst path for being creative. One form of advice that Brandt and Eagleman give to combat this is to proliferate options, to explore 6 different versions of a project rather than one, to follow in the footsteps of Picasso, who painted 58 variations of the painting Las Meninas. A direct example of this would come when Christopher Nolan and Hans Zimmer work on The Dark Knight, when attempting to find the sound that they felt conveyed the energy of the Joker. Before Nolan began shooting the film, he sat down with Zimmer and talked about the Joker, his motivations or the lack of it, and the way he represented no principle in the film other than pure chaos. And Nolan would also note that his Joker would be a force of chaos that is constant. It's a constant one in the film, like that of the presence of the shark in Jaws, something that kind of keeps keeping on and has the characters around it reacting to it rather than understanding and anticipating it. And with this in mind, Zimmer realized the score had to reflect this constancy, a single note of some sort, something urgent, dire, and simple. I'll read from the book here where Tom Schoen beautifully describes Zimmer spending months chiseling away at an idea, plugging away at old synthesizers, making crazy noises and recording musicians experimentally, razor blades on piano wire, pencils scratching tables and floors, long past the point where he should have started writing usable music cues for the film. The result was 400 tracks and 9,000 bars of music, which Zimmer put on an iPod and he gave to Nolan to listen to on a flight over to Hong Kong for the final round of location shooting. So you can see here that Zimmer has avoided taking the path of least resistance, even when he had perhaps had this deadline that probably required him to, instead opting to exhaust all possible options. And by the way, this listening experience Nolan must have had on that flight is pretty hilarious. Just the idea that Nolan would be sat on a plane listening to these horrific noises for hours on end, trying to find something that would be the right level of horrifying for the Joker. And upon touching down, Nolan says to Zimmer, it was a pretty unpleasant experience. I have no idea exactly where the sound of the Joker is in that 9,000 bars, but you feel that it is there. The conclusion to this ends up giving the Joker theme a perfectly unpleasant single cello note that, as the book puts it, slowly slides upwards in a glissando, like a string that's being tightened and tightened without ever quite breaking. It was more tonal experiment than theme, a sound of ever greater dissonance, fusing metallic buzzing and scratching. Now you may be wondering, wait, Hans Zimmer did all of that for what was essentially a single note? This is where Charlie Chaplin's incredible quote we discovered in reading his biography comes into play, where he notes that creativity requires, and I really love this quote, elimination from accumulation as a process of finding what you want. That, to simplify, you must first expand. The thing is, the influences of Nolan's musical experiences at school would not only be limited to that of listening to soundtracks in bed. When working on Interstellar, upon suggesting that Zimmer tried to use the pipe organ to score the music, Hans Zimmer was horrified, and to Zimmer, an artist who had never used the pipe organ before, the instrument only conjured up memories of old Hammer House horror films. Nolan notes this initial suggestion in the book where he says, "The organ thing, I cursed Hans with that. I said, look, I really want a pipe organ. Have you ever done a score with that?" He'd never worked with the organ on other film scores, so he was a bit daunted, but he threw himself into it. But why the organ, and why for Interstellar, a film about space, a genre that usually comprises of more kind of electronic scores? Well, as the book notes, for Nolan, the resonances were more personal. It had been one of the sounds of his childhood. Every morning at Nolan's boarding school from Tuesday to Friday, just after 8 a.m., the entire school would squeeze sardine-like into the chapel for daily service. The service lasted only 10 minutes, just time for a quick pretense of prayer over stomachs rumbling for breakfast and a couple of hymns belted out with varying degrees of enthusiasm to the accompaniment of a pipe organ, of a size normally found in cathedrals, with 54 stops over 3 manual keyboards and pedals. A quote here from Nolan, he says, "On Interstellar, I was very interested in playing with the idea of the organ as one of the tools to inspire religiosity or awe, and so very often, if you listen very carefully to what we're doing in the music, a piece of music will end abruptly, and then you hear the reverberations ring out. By hearing the echo of the music ringing out, we're using it to create a sense of space, even though it's actually created by confinement. We were actually using the confined space of Temple Church, and Interstellar is quite specifically not a religious film, but we're still looking for what you can tap into, what associations you can use to create the feeling of awe, and the organ felt like that." I love this. Not only does Nolan here seek out an instrument that creates literal space with echoes and reverberations of the organ, not by the notes themselves, but what they leave behind. Brilliant. Essentially kind of recognizing the power of contrast. But Nolan also utilizes associations people have with certain sounds and banks on the feelings those associations inspire. This reminds me of the epic Rubens painting of Samson and Delilah that can be found in the National Gallery in London. It's a painting that is striking for the visual component of seeing a bear-like figure in Samson having been defeated by the physically dainty but perniciously manipulative Delilah, who uses the guise of love to coax Samson into revealing his secret weaknesses. But because the painting still depicts Delilah as dainty and even vulnerable in how small she appears next to the strong Samson, you could perhaps miss the message at face value. But the moment of betrayal still simmers as Rubens beautifully manages to layer in an association with betrayal by placing a statue of Venus in the background, a figure often found in classical paintings to represent a pernicious and more overpowering form of seduction. So a lesson here for us is to ask ourselves, what feelings do you want to create in viewers of your art? And to wonder what associations we can borrow from other pre-established forms of art to support our own work. When we ask what other forms of art Nolan himself looks at to borrow associations from, we must look at the relationship Nolan has with architecture and setting. Nolan notes that upon being asked what he would do if he wasn't a filmmaker, he would firstly wonder why he gets asked such a question, but he would then respond with his most commonly used answer. He says, I think architecture is probably the answer I gave most. I think that all architecture, and the best architecture in particular, has a narrative component to it. And despite having never explored it in a professional fashion, the influences of forms, shapes, and ideas found in architecture on his films are plentiful. In one of my favorite references to the impact of architecture, the book speaks of a time that Christopher Nolan visits the Sears Tower in Chicago, which is now known as the Willis Tower. He does so as a teenager during one of his school holidays. But then the book notes how he would return almost 20 years later to film Christian Bale atop the very same building in The Dark Knight, in a beautiful sweeping wide shot that shows Batman listening to various police radio scanners in incoming calls while looking over the city. And I highly recommend finding the scene, I will link it of course, that shows this. It's actually a transitioning shot that occurs after the epic speech by Michael Caine that ends with, "Some men just want to watch the world burn." Nolan is quoted here talking about the Sears Tower as he says, "If you're going to look at architecture in my life, there's no comparison. I would come home on holidays when I was 16 or 17 and go to downtown Chicago and go to the 110th floor of Sears Tower and take photographs." 110th floor, it's crazy. He says, "It's staggering, the architecture and atmosphere of the city. I was very, very interested in that aspect of American urban experience and how architecturally extraordinary that is. America is not a symbolic presence for me. I grew up with it. It's always been part of my life." I love that there's a mention here of what he calls the atmosphere of the city. I think this is something that anyone who's lived outside a major city can perhaps relate to as they think about either the first time they traveled to a major city, or perhaps for those who have lived in it, they experience that feeling as they return to one after having moved out. They know that cities are alive. They seem to represent more than their sprawling nature, nor can they just be put down to there are more buildings. Nolan would try to describe this phenomenon by noting that the city for me has always functioned as a maze. If you look at Following, which is Nolan's first feature film, it's all about loneliness in the middle of the crowd. The threat of the city in the Dark Knight trilogy is very much about the absence of people, lonely streets, lonely architecture at nighttime. I think this observation takes even more precedent in Inception, actually, where he literally has a maze built using the landscape of a city within a dreamscape, using none other than an architect. In the book, Nolan tries to further describe the impact of spaces and environments on us as people traversing through them. He notes here that one of the things I was fascinated by when I was younger was this phenomenon of when you first go into an architectural space, when you move into a building, you have this sort of feeling. Then you walk there or you live there and that impression just shifts. It completely changes. And for some reason, I'm able to remember that initial impression, that incomplete understanding of the space and how it made me feel. And this quote is excellent. It actually reminds me of when I first discovered the masterful interior designer Ilsa Crawford. I kind of had it in my mind previously that, interior design was this mostly aesthetic art form that reduced its inspirations, in my mind at least, to Pinterest boards and whatever looked good on Architectural Digest for a particular week. But listening to Ilsa Crawford, it had my mind shift on how the art form is even approached. Because instead, Ilse helped me understand that designing for spaces like the way that interior designers do is much more about architecting and manipulating mood and emotion. I noted down a quote here from a documentary that Ilse Crawford is in where she mentions that we discover the world through our senses. It was less about the aesthetics or the appearance, but much more about how to make an environment that made people feel better after they'd been there than when they arrived. That means that when people walk into it, they don't know why they feel the way they feel, but it's actually all been orchestrated. But at the same time, Nolan also recognizes that the relationship with a space is transient and reliant almost on the circumstances in your life at any point in time. I note this because he says how at the end of Inception, the main character of Cobb goes through immigration and gets his passport stamped. That's always been a resonant moment for me because I don't take for granted that you'll always hand over your passport and they'll always say, come in. I was told when I was a child that I would have to decide when I turned 18 whether to have a British citizenship or an American citizenship. Fortunately, I didn't have to make that choice because it would have been impossible. So I've never taken these things for granted. And Nolan and his wife, Emma Thompson, now seem to live in LA where their kids are at school, but his wife apparently speaks about how she misses England, and yet Christopher Nolan does not. He says he doesn't miss it because he knows he can go back at any time and that he doesn't miss America when he's in England for work for the same reason. He says, I really enjoy going to different places. I enjoy that process of refreshing. It's that change of gears I had growing up. I thrived on that back and forth. For me, it's about switch flipping. You go from one culture, you go to the other, and I've always enjoyed that change. I've always found it invigorating. And this love of travel, of refreshing and of contrast is very present in his films, even placing characters we've never seen out that home. I'm thinking of Batman, and they put him in Hong Kong rather than staying within the confines of Gotham City like he'd always done until that point. There's this quote about Nolan's philosophy about what he does when he arrives in a new environment that he also relates to filmmaking, and I absolutely love this. He says, one of the things I try to teach my kids is when we go to a new city, I like to wander around and get lost and then explain to them how I managed to find my way without a phone, without a map. I don't worry about getting lost because if you're a tourist, it doesn't really matter when you turn up at a place. It's about embarrassment. I just embrace that and say, look, we'll get lost, but we'll find our way. Amazing. This is then where he relates it to filmmaking. He says, it's something that applies to filmmaking very, very directly because you look at the plan of a set you're building and then you have to be able to visualize the subjective shots on the ground if you're going to build that up. You're always reconciling two-dimensional imagery with three-dimensional space. You're always introducing subjective shots with, okay, where is that in relation to the other things that are going on? It's about the world of the film. The geography of stories is very important to me, and it's something I'm conscious of as I'm planning a film. You can see just in this, again, that we're arriving at that place that echoes the advice we mentioned earlier regarding avoiding the path of least resistance. And it's true, there is a mastery that is developed when you approach something as though you're looking to get lost on purpose, almost with this idea that you'll develop skills by finding your way again. And this reminds me of the famous biographer Robert Caro, who has spent 40 years writing biographies on the President Lyndon Johnson, who insists in writing everything he researched up in longhand in order to better retain the information. He advises that slow is better, that slow is smart. And I actually do the very same thing for the podcast because I could easily see where I could just get a Kindle and highlight quotes on that and simply download those highlights almost instantly. But instead, I've opted to read these books in a paperback copy where I'm required to write notes by hand and on the page as I read it, and then have to reread the book again effectively to hunt down those notes and highlights. It's this slower, longer approach that allows me to develop the muscle of connecting the dots and making the podcast feel more alive than if I were just to be reading a bunch of highlights out of context. And so we've now got this sense of how Nolan uniquely works with actors, incorporates music, and thinks about the visual parallels that he can make. And yet when you watch a Christopher Nolan film, you know that there's nothing more unique to them than their narrative structure. I think starting from his first film, Following, that jumps around between two timelines, which forces you to fit shots and scenes in your head that you've already seen into the first timeline as it kind of catches up with those very scenes that were teased earlier in the film, only to be revealed to be much later in the chronology of the film. He'd keep this up with Memento, his second film, which has two timelines running towards each other, one running forwards and one running backwards, and also meeting in the middle narratively, by which time you're at the end of the film's runtime. Are you still following me? Because this lack of consistency in chronology may first intimidate people and viewers of his work, but ultimately by making something seemingly more familiar on the surface, yet complex as you move into it, Nolan's work demands a level of engagement perhaps not felt much before by mainstream cinema goers. And I still remember the general response by critics to Inception when it first came out. The film was too complicated, too hard to understand, and yet Inception is now one of the most beloved of his films. The thing is, I actually think that this complexity is actually a big part of why Nolan's work has so many hardcore fans. People can't help but feel deeply involved as their mind tries to figure out what they were watching while they're watching it, but also afterwards as well. You know, about Memento, Nolan actually says here, "The thing I was most proudest of is that your experience of the film was not just the film running through the projector. It bled off in all these different ways. It created a three-dimensional narrative." But where did he get the confidence to start messing around with this structure so early on? Well, during the editing of Following, a film that he had originally written in chronological order, his then girlfriend and now wife Emma Thomas brought home a script she'd gotten her hands on working as a production coordinator at Working Title. It was Quentin Tarantino's feature film, Pulp Fiction. Nolan in the book says, "I was very heavily influenced by Reservoir Dogs, so I was very interested to see what he had done for his follow-up. If you look at Pulp Fiction and Citizen Kane, they have a lot of similarities in terms of their structure. In no other media is there this insistence that information be introduced chronologically. There's none, not in novels, plays, Greek mythology, Homer, and I think that all has to do with television. The birth of the home video is a seminal moment in film narrative and the narrative structures that film can adopt. From the 1950s to about the mid-1980s, I'd say every movie made had to play on television. There's this era of chronological conservatism that Pulp Fiction pretty much brought to a close." And I love here that Nolan points out that there are no rules saying a film has to be linear, right? And yet, it would seem a natural instinct that this is the structure we have to follow in filmmaking. But as it turns out, upon Nolan's, closer examination, it was actually a blindly followed convention, one that Nolan could easily leave behind once he figured out there was nothing tying him to it. Around the time that Following came out, Nolan had first started talking to journalists, and he became aware that we rarely even follow chronological order in our everyday lives. Nolan says, "When you read a newspaper, you read the headline, and then you read the story. Then you read the story the next day, and add to your knowledge, and then the next week. It's a process of expansion, a filling in of detail, and making connections, not based on chronology, but on the particulars of the story. We don't tend to have chronological conversations either. They go all over the place." That was very interesting to me. The more I thought about it, the more conscious I became of it. In the business world, founder of the startup incubator that brought businesses like Airbnb and Stripe to the world, Paul Graham writes in an essay about the nature of what he calls schlep businesses. He notes that many startup ideas go unexploited because people are mostly averse to tedious, unpleasant tasks, things that he calls schleps. The thing is, most people have a disliking to these kind of tasks, often wishing to avoid them and opting to create startups around more familiar problems that perhaps have been partly solved for by something that's already existing in the market. And yet the biggest opportunities, according to Graham, seemingly lie in the very issues that most startup founders tend to avoid. The most important part of this, however, is that the experience is unconscious. It's not that these founders consciously avoid these problems, but rather they just find themselves solving in a territory that's more approachable and familiar. Well, this is what Nolan figures out too. He discovered the schlep in the art of filmmaking, an unconventional narrative structure that would take audience into the future and then into the past and then back to the future again. And by keeping to the more conventional narrative structure, filmmakers were actually opting for a more natural and thus more pleasurable form to work with. But Nolan saw it for what it was. It was a lack of trying to tackle something simply because it was difficult and scary. It was playing bowling with the gutter guards up. So a lesson for us here is to look at where people blindly follow convention and see if you can break it. Because you may as well find that by doing that, you realize it was quite an easy thing to step away from, and you may even arrive at a new style that you come to love as a result of it, just like Nolan. But also keep in mind that it seems that there is this kind of first principle thinking approach to Nolan's ideas of what to do. He doesn't just abandon classical structures for fun, he just devises his processes and solutions based on the story's requirement rather than based on what's already been done. And although Nolan's first feature film played around with his now famous structure, he actually did learn the convention he'd later abandoned when he picked up a camera at the young age of 8. This camera was a Super 8, something that his father had gotten him, and it's with this camera that he would shoot a series of homemade space epics in his parents' basement that featured Action Man and Star Wars figures. Nolan talks about the impact of making these in the book, noting that everything I did in filmmaking was a slow evolution, and as a kid, it was just about putting interesting images together and getting a narrative to it, because the Super 8 was silent, of course. So, unlike kids today, who have sound at their disposal, it was purely an image-making process. I was reading Sergei Einstein's book Film Form the other day, and the argument he makes is you take shot A and shot B and put them together, and that gives you thought C. And that, I realize now, is what I was working out for myself. The book actually further explains the idea of this film theorist Sergei Einstein, who, the book notes, is the first cinema structuralist thinker. Famously, he compared the art of cinematic montage to Japanese kanji, where the combination of two characters of the simplest series is more than just the sum of its two parts. It creates a third meaning. And this actually reminds me of an Alfred Hitchcock analysis, which I think is inspired by the same book, of the filmmaking technique of montage. In a short demonstration, he shows the image of an older man smiling. It's actually himself, but he shows this older man smiling, and this first follows the image of a woman playing with a baby with a hard cut. So you see the image of the baby, and then you see a hard cut to the older man, and it's the older man smiling. So you can kind of judge this as an older, kinder man who's, fond of seeing pleasant things, I suppose. But then you replace that initial image of the baby and the mother and replace it with a younger woman sunbathing in a bikini, and suddenly our judgment of the reaction of the older man changes. He's not this kindly older man anymore, he's the dirty old man, as Hitchcock puts it. As Nolan would put it best, the greatest special effect in all of filmmaking is the cut. And Nolan's very true to his word, as the simple cut would come to help him greatly in editing Inception. The book notes every night Nolan would screen dailies being these kind of raw, unedited footage that's shot during the day's filming. And as they got further into post-production, Nolan started screening the film for select friends, something he hadn't done since The Prestige, which had a similarly complicated plot, to see how it was working. Nolan talks about this here. He says, somewhere a few weeks into the cut, where normally you'd be gaining a little bit of confidence that it's coming together, we had a screening, and we just hit this wall of exposition. We got stuck on that for a long time, and we were just white sheets afterwards. I couldn't get to sleep for a couple of days. It was just awful. As you make a film, as you find a film, most things tend to work along the sliding scale of, yeah, that's going to get better. We just need to tweak that. And then you adjust it all. It's like tightening with lug nuts on a tire. You do this one, and then this one, and then this one, and so on, and it keeps the rotation. Before I continue this quote, I love this part of describing the editing process as finding the film as a process that requires constant tightening like that of nuts on a tire. Beautiful. I love that. And sometimes I feel finding a great creative design in my work is like that. You've done the prep, you understand the problem, but you know that the best solution is not the first one that you have, and that instead you just need to create and then evaluate and create again and evaluate again and so on until you find the perfect solution. But back to the book. But every now and again, you get somewhere where it just doesn't get better. And you're like, this will never work. This we will never get past. So what do? I haven't had too many of them in my career, but that was one. Now, before I reveal exactly what Nolan did, I want to ask you a simple question. If you've seen Inception, have a think about this question. The question is, who does Michael Caine play in Inception? And I think when you think about that, perhaps you get a sense that he's this important mentor figure, right? Who's Position at the University of Paris allows him to introduce Cobb to the architect Ariadne. But let me be more specific with my question. What is the relationship between Michael Caine's character to Leonardo DiCaprio's character of Cobb? And with that more specific question, perhaps now you're thinking about how his mentor-like position comes from the fact that he taught Cobb about dream manipulation, something that Cobb does briefly mention in the film. Or perhaps you're wondering if Michael Caine plays Cobb's father, considering Cobb does give Michael Caine's character some gifts to give to his kids, and that he welcomes Cobb at the airport upon his return to America. Now that you've thought about that, let me go back to the book. The solution was a ruthless cut, chopping the scene more or less in half in a way that would forever leave a small question mark in some audience members' minds over the exact relationship of Caine's character to DiCaprio's. The original scene, this is now a quote from Nolan, the original scene clarified every point of everything that anyone could ever ask about the logic or the history of the story, and we basically cut the scene in half. We went out to lunch and we talked about it, and I said, what if we don't worry about explaining? What if you allow people to misunderstand certain things? Because a lot of people see the film and they think Professor Miles is the father, not his father-in-law. We just said that, you know what? Let's just let that happen. I don't ever remember doing a film where I let go of actual narrative points like that. That is to say, I'm not going to explain this guy's relationship. It doesn't matter that much to the audience, or they'll figure it out if they want to. Those type of cuts are very unusual for me. But once we'd done that, it became a little less of a stopping point. I actually found myself watching Inception again in preparation for this podcast before I read this part of the book, and I actually found myself Googling what was the relationship between these two characters, which led me to learn that he's Cobb's wife's father. But it's true, even without that knowledge, the story is not affected. So the lesson here for us is to constantly question, what can we afford to let go of? And to do this more than we think, because like I do when I cut out whole 10-minute chunks from these podcast episodes in the edit, we might find ourselves surprised as to how much we can remove and still find that the narrative works. And in fact, sometimes even works better without the fluff. But in 2020, when Christopher Nolan's movie Tenet came out, Nolan showed us that it wasn't just the sequence that shots was shown in that he was willing to play around with in the editing suite. He was keen to play around with the very shots themselves. Although he crafts wonderfully engaging stories, Christopher Nolan's films are mostly exciting because we recognize that he's ultimately a director who likes exploring concepts using the vehicle of his movies. And it's because of this that Nolan is someone who is fascinated and in love with both ideas of physics, time, dreams, and space, while simultaneously fascinated in the love with the technicalities of his art medium, with the effect that the image has, and with identifying the defining components of a film genre. And to me, there is no more obvious example of a film that displays this more technical fascination in Nolan's filmography than Tenet. And Tenet is a film, I will admit, that elicits mixed emotions, even from some of the most hardcore of Nolan's fans. But it's an interesting film to examine for the way in which its origins are found in the very first shot of Nolan's second feature film, Memento. Memento opens with what appears to be our main character shooting someone in the head, the bullet casing flying out the side of the gun, and then our main character taking a Polaroid of the man he's just murdered. Only this is not the order that we see this sequence. Nolan instead shows us this in reverse chronology. Ever since crafting that opening shot of Memento, Nolan has been dying to return to a similar reality, a reality that only a camera can show us, a reality where, in this case, audiences can experience both objects and people traveling in reverse as a result of backwards entropy. In the book, Nolan notes of what sparked such a desire. He says, I remember when the first real good slow-mo came into broadcasting. It was the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. When they slowed it right down, I remember the hands of the gymnasts going around on the parallel bars. You could see this happening, so you could understand and see things you couldn't before. You were looking at the world in a new way. Slow motion is one version of that. Reverse imaging is another version. You're seeing a real thing, but it's showing you a world you couldn't see any other way. There is no way before photography to see reverse imagery or even imagine that it exists. And that, to me, is what makes Tenet the absolute most cinematic film I've ever been able to put together. It can only exist because of the camera. And now, to manifest this in Tenet with some logic that kind of makes sense in the story, Nolan conceives of a machine that rotates as it closes and opens its two doors, reversing the entropy of an object or a person in it as it does so. And I hope I did a good job of explaining what a turnstile, as it's called in the film, does, because the thing is, this is only the beginning when it comes to the difficulties of explaining the ideas that Nolan is so fascinated in. And that's where Nolan's love of the medium of film really helps. Because instead of leaving audiences in a completely unfamiliar and frankly daunting experience, Nolan instead helps audiences get closer to new concepts he wants to examine by attaching the film around it to genre tropes that are more recognizable. He first does this with Inception. He actually recognizes that a film simply about dreams would be pretty hard to approach and opts instead to making a heist film, a genre of film that was well established by the themes laid out in its predecessors like The Italian Job and Ocean's 11. Well, the book notes here how he thought in a similar manner about Tenet and the spy genre. He says, "On this film, I wanted to use the familiarity of the conventions to help the audience get to this other place. My ambition for the film was to do to spy movies what Sergio Leone had done to the Western, some distillation of essence. I have a hunch that when Leone made A Fistful of Dollars, he didn't look at any old Westerns. It's just his memory of them. It's the feel of them. So the influence of James Bond on Tenet is colossal, but I didn't watch any James Bond films. In fact, I probably went the longest period of my life ever not watching a Bond film because it's not a real Bond film. It's your memory of it that's important and what it could be. You want to distill the essence of that secret agent thing. I actually love impressionist paintings for this very reason, by the way, because by their very form, they're an impression of a place, of a mood, of an event, not the most accurate depiction of it. And although Impressionist painters typically painted their scenery while observing it directly, often working outdoors to capture the effects of the light and the atmosphere, it's true that the result is the essence rather than the details. They're ultimately pleasant and inviting to look at because this essence of a place is kind of what allows us as viewers to experience it, to feel that we know this place. Like, we might not have been to the French countryside, but we know this mood. We know we've seen this time of day, these type of rolling hills. The details might not be there, but as a result, we're more likely to connect with it and fill it with our own. Another way that Nolan gets the essence is by allowing a lot of time to think between projects and to think about a project before he ever begins writing it. Before even writing a word for Oppenheimer, Nolan read American Prometheus, the book that the film was based on, a few times over, before spending a long time just thinking about what he recalled from it, what stood out to him, and what he would tell someone about the story. And I relate to this a lot because it's effectively what I love about making these podcast episodes. You know, I too think about what I would tell someone, a friend, about the person I've just studied, and the things that immediately float to the top are usually the stories, the insight, not all the details, but definitely the essence. But once he's found this essence, the first thing Nolan writes isn't actually the screenplay. The book notes that before starting work on the script for Interstellar, Nolan dusted off his typewriter and typed out a one-page précis summarizing his vision for the film. He does this with all of his films. I'll bang out a page or a paragraph of what I think the film needs, like the big picture. What is the thing that I'm trying to do? And then I put that away and come back to it every now and again just to remind myself, because you can get lost in things as you start to figure out the mechanics of how a story can work. And I love this. By first typing out a one-pager for his vision of a film, Nolan has effectively created a compass for himself, a kind of guide to return to as to not get lost in the weeds. As he notes, it's very difficult once you're fully engaged in that mechanism. It can be very, very hard to remember what it is that you were trying to do in a bigger sense. And whilst this is a great practice for us to think about doing before every artistic project to guide us during the making of it, as it turns out, this is not its only purpose. And for Interstellar, he actually shared this precis with one of his favorite collaborators, Hans Zimmer. In doing this, he brought Zimmer right into the mix, having him actually score a segment of the film before he ever even saw a script for the film. As Nolan remarks, I called Hans before I even knew I was going to do the project, and I told him, I'm going to bring you an envelope with a letter in it on a piece of paper that's going to tell you the underlying fable at the heart of what we're going to make. You get one day, just write something, and you have to give it to me at the end of the day. And that will be the seed from which the score can grow. We realized that we'd spent so much time on the other films we'd done near the end of the process, trying to penetrate the mechanisms we'd created and get back to the heart of the story. This time I thought, let's flip the process. Let's start with the score and then build out. This is brilliant. Nolan solves the problem of scoring by inverting the process. It's a very Nolan thing to do if you think about it. And author of the book Clear Thinking, Shane Parrish, would actually write about using inversion as a mental model for solving a problem, as he notes that the root of inversion is invert, which means to upend or turn upside down. As a thinking tool, it means approaching a situation from the opposite end of the natural starting point. Most of us tend to think one way about a problem, forward. Inversion allows you to flip the problem around and think backwards. Sometimes it's good to start at the beginning, but it can be more useful to start at the end. And this actually reminds me of Josh Waitzkin, who's a chess master, whose life the film Searching for Bobby Fischer is based on, who advises that when you first learn chess, you should concentrate on the endings rather than the openings. Because this way, as the chess game goes on and you move closer to that end game, you get stronger and you get more confident. Your game becomes about moving towards something you know rather than starting strong but then getting lost. Back to the book. On the paper was a short story about a father and a child, a son, that reminded him of a conversation that Nolan, his wife Emma, and Zimmer had had in London a few years earlier. They were dining at the Wolseley restaurant, a big, busy Art Deco restaurant in London's Piccadilly Circus. They were talking about their children. Zimmer, whose son was then 15 years old, said, "Once your children are born, you can never look at yourself through your own eyes anymore. You always look at yourself through their eyes." And I love how Nolan is able to pull an entire story idea from this one passing sentence during dinner. It reminds me of how Charlie Chaplin, as we learned in the episode that covers him, how he's able to kind of create an entire story from the origin of one joke or one gag or one trick. And about this, Chaplin says, "I have discovered that ideas come through an intense desire for them. Continually desiring, the mind becomes a watchtower on the lookout for incidents that may excite the imagination. Music, a sunset, may give image to an idea." This really goes to show how ideas are everywhere, and when you're on the lookout for them, you can find them in the smallest moments. Back to the book, Zimmer wrote for a day, and at 9 p.m. the next day, he finished a 4-minute piece of music for piano and strings, inspired by the feelings of what it meant to be a father. He phoned Emma Thomas to let her know that he was done. "Do you want me to send it over?" he asked. "Oh, he's curiously antsy. Do you mind if he comes down?" Thomas replied. So Nolan got in the car and drove to Zimmer's studio in Santa Monica and sat on his couch. Zimmer made the usual excuses a composer makes when he or she starts playing to somebody for the first time, not looking at Nolan, just staring straight ahead, and then when he was finished, he turned around. He could tell Nolan was moved by it. And in response, Nolan simply says, "I suppose I better make the movie now." "But what is the movie?" asked Zimmer. And the filmmaker started describing this huge, epic tale of space and philosophy, science and humanity. "Chris, hang on. I've just written this highly personal thing, you know." "Yes," said Nolan. "But now I know where the heart of the movie is." And just like that, Zimmer had helped give Nolan, his new film, a musical core, a kind of rooted tree trunk, if you will, before all the complicated branches started to grow. As the book notes, what Zimmer had told him that night in London, "Once your children are born, you can never look at yourself through your own eyes anymore. You always look at yourself through their eyes," had become now a sort of fable, says Nolan. You could read it as a ghost story, that notion of the parent as a ghost of your child's future. That was in the fable I gave him, because I wanted him to write music that was the emotional heart of that story. It's about the parent revisiting the child as a ghost and struggling then to be free. This fable was born from an emotional depth that Nolan understood very well, because in writing the initial short story, Nolan was actually thinking about his daughter, Flora, who was 11 at the time, and the heartache that's involved whenever he went off to make a film. And we know from the intro how selective he is about the films he decides to make. Because of this, the book notes Nolan's perspective here. He says, "I very much related to this dilemma of somebody who is having to go off and do this thing, leave his kids, whom he dearly wants to be with, but really wants to go and do this thing. My job is something that I absolutely love. I consider myself unbelievably lucky to do it, but there's a lot of guilt involved in doing that. A lot of guilt. I have a daughter who is the same age as the character. In my brother's draft, it was a son. Interstellar was actually written originally by his brother, Jonathan Nolan. I turned it into a daughter because Flora was about that age when I was making it. As my kids were growing up, I had this desire to hang on to the past. You become quite melancholy about how fast it's going. All parents talk about it. All parents experience it. So Interstellar came from a very personal place." As you could kind of tell here, this also links back to the idea of time being this kind of enemy that we explored earlier, and ultimately this was a very personal, deep dilemma that Nolan faced, something that he clearly felt he needed to create art about and as a means of exploring, and I hope that this was actually a cathartic process. But his earlier film, Inception, also had a similar realization at the heart of it, except this realization actually took much, much longer. Inception was actually a film that Nolan started thinking about whilst at university. He'd do this really interesting thing where most nights he would stay up until 4 a.m, but due to having paid ahead for breakfast with his university accommodation, Nolan would set an alarm up a few hours later in the morning in order to get up for it, not wanting to miss out on his prepaid breakfast, of course, totally get that. And then having had the breakfast, he would then return to sleep. And it was on the back of having that very little sleep that Nolan's mind would be in the ideal state to participate into what's known as lucid dreaming. And as someone who's experienced lucid dreaming, this is a kind of dreaming where the dreamer becomes aware that they're dreaming and is capable of control and able to kind of manipulate the content and the physics in that dream because of this awareness. And luckily, when this happens, unlike in Inception, you aren't attacked by the other people in it. But this awareness starts to fascinate Nolan, and I think this is reflected in the dialogue between Cobb and Ariadne as the line, "Sometimes it feels like almost creating itself, genuine inspiration." The idea of exploring dreams would actually stay with him throughout his adult life until after having left university, started work, and even having made his first 2 films. And so Nolan would sit down and begin to work on the script for what became Inception. And by 2001, Nolan first pitched this film to Warner Brothers, but actually decided that he needed to have more experience for making what he determined would be a much larger scale film. And it was not until February 2009 that it was announced that Warner Brothers had purchased Nolan's Inception spec script 9 years after first having started writing it. But the thing is, it was not just that he required a larger scale filming experience, something that you would obviously get with the first 2 Batman films, but it was actually that the script needed to be completed, and that it actually spent much of those 9 years in a desk drawer, only 2/3 written. In Nolan's own words here, he says, "I didn't have the kids when I first wrote it, or tried to write it because I couldn't finish it. I managed to get 80 pages in. I'd gotten into the beginning of the 3rd act and then got stuck. And I stayed stuck for years and years, and at the end of the day, it just didn't lead anywhere that paid off." The book notes that whilst making The Dark Knight, however, a long shoot of 123 days during which Emma Thomas, his wife, became pregnant with their 4th child, Nolan became acutely aware as never before of the time spent away from his family. Back to Nolan speaking himself, he says, "Back then it felt more like a choice, and I remember thinking, I know it's more fun when we're all together and we can do this thing together. That's why we keep it as a family business." We were learning how to balance those things. I think that's the experience that crystallized the aspect of Inception, the call that Cobb has to his kids, trying to talk to them on the phone, the sandcastles on the beach. And since shooting Memento, Nolan doesn't really ever go on a break for at least a decade. And so, whilst The Dark Knight was premiering and smashing box office records, Christopher Nolan and his family went on a month-long holiday to the beaches of Florida. And here the beaches were, as described in the book, powdery white quartz-like sand. And whilst watching his youngest son making sandcastles, the image struck in his head. And upon their return from Florida, Nolan retrieved his script from Inception, a script that he had to dig up from his desk drawer, waiting after being abandoned in 2002. The script finally worked because suddenly you understood the emotional stakes. I hadn't known how to finish the script emotionally. I think I had to grow into it. Who would have guessed that, Inception, with its incredibly complex ideas of the realm of dreams, turned out to be something that needed the necessary step of maturity from its writer in order to turn its story to have the required depth. This reminds me actually of the writer and famous author Ryan Holiday, who, upon having his first desire to write a book, was actually advised to wait a while before doing so. He was encouraged instead to live a bit more life, noting that anyone can write, but not everyone has a life interesting enough to write from. And of course, that image of children playing in the sand and in the ground in general is one that haunts Inception's main character Cobb, whilst he longs for a time when he can reunite with his own. And by the way, what you get from Tom Schoen's incredible book is that this isn't the only image that Nolan pulls from his own life and puts directly into Inception. In one photograph placed here in the book, you can see Nolan and his wife, Emma Thomas, both resting their heads on a set of abandoned tracks whilst on holiday in California. And if you've seen Inception, this makes way for an important turning point in the lives of the movie's, central couple. And amazingly, in another photograph, we see Christopher Nolan and his daughter Flora, who's still a baby, both playing with a pinwheel. And this photograph is almost recreated like for like in the incredibly important prop photograph of the father and his son, representing a younger version of Maurice and Robert Fisher in the film, which ultimately give the sub-narrative component of the film, despite only having, minimal screen time, an extremely impactful and emotional resolution. In the film, the main character of Cobb notes that in the real world, we'd have to choose, but not here. And it makes me think of how Nolan is able to explore the hard, emotional reality a lot of parents seem to face when they're required to spend so much time away from their children in an environment in the world of film, basically. A place where he has much more control over the laws that govern the character's choices and whether this emotional tension is ever relieved or not. But what I love about Nolan is actually how he ends up approaching this tension of time away from the family in his own personal life. For example, in what could have been many decades of time away from his wife at work, Nolan instead found a producing partner who's worked alongside him on every single one of his films. I'm of course talking about Nolan's wife, Emma Thomas. Nolan and Thomas actually met at university, with the book noting that he spends most of his time down in the basement of the Film and TV Society, learning firsthand how to operate cameras, how to edit, to cut film by hand, and to sync sound. And by the way, this is only unusual because he was actually studying English literature at university, not film as you might expect. Meeting every Wednesday at lunchtime, he and the Society's members would choose the slate of films they were going to show in the theatre above. Wayne's World, 1492, Conquest of Paradise, or the 1992 director's cut of Blade Runner. The money collected from the screenings would then be used to finance short films by the Society's members. Among them, composer David Julian, whose name you'll recognize if you're a fan of the soundtracks of Nolan's first films, Following, Insomnia, and Prestige, and actors Jeremy Theobald, Alex Hoare, Lucy Russell, and of course, Nolan's future wife and producing partner, Emma Thomas. Nolan says here, "We were in the same hall of residence. I remember seeing her on the evening of my first day. After we met, we ran the Film Society together, which is where we developed our shared love of celluloid, cutting on film, projecting on 35mm. That's something we really came to love doing together. We spent 3 years in college, making short films, running the Film Society, raising money to make more films. We ended up making a lot of friends there. It was a terrific environment because it was student-led. There was somebody who knew about sound, somebody who knew the camera, somebody who knew about acting. It was full of interesting people who knew how to do this or that, but didn't necessarily want to make films themselves. looking for people with ideas. I learned a huge amount about the craft of putting films together because not everybody would be available. So I had to do a bit of everything. I was able to learn by doing. It was a great education. I love that. Learn by doing. Very much like Da Vinci. This also shows how Nolan kind of armed himself with just enough knowledge about everything in filmmaking required in order to kind of be a more well-versed director who can orchestrate every arm of a production, which is important because especially deeply technical people, they always appreciate when a person in charge is at least somewhat aware of what is required to do the work that they do, rather than just being able to pull off some technical magic without really understanding what they've asked for. Funny enough, despite having studied interface design at university, something completely irrelevant to film, I actually had this first-hand experience of the kind of bubble-like environment that was student-led in regards to aspiring filmmakers, with one of my best friends being part of the film course at the same university. And I'd participate at their hosted movie nights too, a fun one because they had this series of what they'd considered to be films that were so bad they were good. But ultimately, it was the discussions and the unrelenting sense of energy that was palpable, even for me as someone who was really like an outsider looking in. But to go back to another key point made earlier, it seems that Nolan was likely having these kind of exploding discussions with his future wife, which is just amazing. Following university, Emma and Chris ended up living together, and one night on their return to their flat in Camden, they discovered their front door had been kicked in, and some CDs, books, and personal mementos were missing. He was also missing a bag identified by the police to help establish that the thieves likely used it to stash stolen goods. This could have been a traumatic event that you'd want to quickly move past emotionally, but Nolan's alternate reaction was brilliant. He says, "I think the raw and immediate response is, it's just repulsive. In the moment when you see all your stuff dumped out of drawers and sitting on the floor, you're suddenly in a very intimate relationship with someone you'll never see or know. But then, when I put myself into their position as a writer, I started connecting to things. The first thing I realized is that they kicked the door in. When I really looked at it, I realized that a front door is entirely symbolic. I mean, this thing was made of plywood. It wasn't keeping anybody out. It was utterly flimsy. But of course, I'd never thought about that, because when you shut a front door and it locks, that's a sacred thing. That was a revelation for me, and it got me thinking, what happens if someone starts violating those conventions? And this is how Nolan started to think about his first film, Following. And after having been rejected by film school, yes, Christopher Nolan himself was rejected by film school, Nolan got a job working as a corporate video producer. And it was at this time that he began to write the script for Following on the typewriter that we talked about earlier, teaching himself to touch type as he went along. Emma Thomas had, by this point, secured her job as a production coordinator at Working Title, and she, in the meantime, helped apply to various sources for funds. But upon being repeatedly turned down, they decided to simply use the bonus from his cameraman job and shoot the film only on weekends for almost a year, rehearsing each scene carefully, almost like a play, so that they could shoot it in 1 or 2 takes, working out that they could only afford to shoot and process between 10 and 15 minutes of footage a week. He told his actors not to leave town or get a haircut. Every weekend, everyone would squeeze into the back of a taxi and head to whatever location they'd been able to scrounge. Nolan's parents' house or a friend's restaurant where they shot without permits. Nolan operating the camera himself. He would get the film process by Tuesday, editing in his head as he went, and repeat the whole process until they were done. This is incredible. What an amazing lesson on, a first director's resourcefulness. It's worth noting that the debut budgets for first-time directors of a similar time, you've got Quentin Tarantino, who made Reservoir Dogs with $1.2 million. Paul Thomas Anderson made Hard 8 with $3 million. And Wes Anderson made Bottle Rocket with $5 million. These are all fairly small amounts when you consider the budgets of most films, particularly that of what Nolan's making today. But all the while, Nolan's Following had a budget that totaled to only $6,000. What? And when you watch Following, you realize that Nolan did something very clever. He took the technical limitations and financial limitations and worked with them by building them into the story. I'll give you a simple example of this. He would, shoot in black and white and place the story in the noir genre. And these choices gave the film a kind of dark tone, which helps you forgive any of the graininess of the film and makes the emptiness of the shot seem intentional as a way of giving the film a kind of eeriness. If you imagine instead Nolan shot the film in color and made it an action film, perhaps this graininess would make the film look cheap, and the lack of background actors would probably have been more obvious. So Nolan's resourcefulness and clever thinking here is paramount to him making an impact. But secondly, it's worth noting that his wife Emma worked alongside him in this pursuit, seemingly never questioning if this was a good use of their time together as a couple, handing him scripts of films not yet made like that of Pulp Fiction and attempting to get his film funded instead. It seems that their self-belief was unified, and together they've made an incredible catalogue of films. Nolan notes this in the book when he says, "Emma has had such a profound impact on my life, my work, and how I go about things. We've collaborated on everything I've done. She's always been involved in casting decisions, and she's always the first point of contact in terms of story." But here's the thing, Nolan's wife is not his only close collaborator in his family. Jonathan Nolan, or Jonah Nolan, Christopher Nolan's younger brother, is a screenwriter, and he's helped to make a lot of Christopher Nolan's films, including The Prestige, The Dark Knight, The Dark Knight Rises, and Interstellar. He's also responsible for creating the HBO show Westworld, of which the season 1 is perhaps one of the best seasons of TV ever made, and he actually also made that alongside his wife, Lisa Joy. But as the book notes, the professional collaboration between Jonathan and Christopher Nolan started while Nolan was in England editing Following. Jonah had been attending psychology class in his final year of college, learning about anterograde amnesia. Not the kind of amnesia suffered by characters of soap operas where everything is lost, but the kind where you have difficulty forming new memories after a traumatic incident. Jonah was fascinated by this. But whilst on a road trip through the US, Jonathan turned to Christopher Nolan, who was driving, and explained to him his recent fascination. As he noted, "It's not like those amnesia movies where the guy doesn't know anything, so anything can be true. It's different. He knows who he was, but not who he has become." And thus planted the seed for Memento, as Christopher Nolan, who usually was a keen critic of Jonathan's ideas, fell silent and listened to him before noting, "That's a terrific idea for a movie." As the book notes, they stopped for gas, and when they got back in the car, he asked Jonah outright, could he write a script from his story? Jonah agreed, and they fell to throwing ideas around excitedly as the roadside streamed by. Christopher and Jonathan Nolan end up writing at the same time, with Jonathan working on a short story version while Christopher worked on a screenplay for a film version of the story. And here's the thing, unlike Following, which Christopher Nolan wrote chronologically as the events occurred and chopped up afterwards, Memento was written straight through as you see it in the film, so that Christopher Nolan could experience and encounter things as the main character does. He says, "I wrote the script totally from Leonard's point of view," Leonard being the main character. "I would put myself in his position and start examining and questioning my own process of memory, purely subjectively, and the choices you make about what to remember and what not to remember." Nolan examines his ideas deeply, and as we noted with all the concepts and subconcepts he explores in Inception, but that examination does something different in Memento. It actually gives the main character of Leonard consistency when his world is far from consistent. And this character-first approach allowed Nolan to stumble onto ideas like how Leonard would need to systematize things. In writing the script for Oppenheimer, Nolan would take this idea one step further as he writes what is known to be the only major screenplay to have ever had the stage directions written in first person, giving the film a subjective perspective all the way through, something that's truly fascinating if you think about the fact that the subject matter is that of the atomic bombs, which is usually spoken in the most objective historical view as a topic could have. So a lesson for us here is to try and examine things from the perspective of our character, whether in a film, a painting, a song, a novel, to try to give something a subjective perspective, not just because you're avoiding finding the objective truth of a situation, but because subjectivity comes with the human details, the little intricate thoughts and considerations that only reveal themselves when you're able to step into someone's shoes and see the world in their constrained perspective. But the larger lesson from seeing how Christopher Nolan works with both his brother and his wife on his films is to make your family one of your collaborators, particularly with a life partner, if you think about it, like with Emma Thomas, because if you're deciding that you want to spend so much of your life with this person, you will have to embrace the emotional difficulty of being away from them as you attend to your work. So perhaps one strategy is to choose someone who is passionate about your art too, not like a copy of you, but someone who complements your skill set and perhaps provides a perspective that you cherish in making decisions from time to time, like Nolan does with both his brother and his wife. After making Batman Begins and teasing the Joker at the end of it, Nolan surprised audiences by following it up not with another Batman film, but rather with The Prestige, a movie about two rival stage musicians set in Victorian England. And to be honest, if you haven't seen it and you just heard that description alone, you think, there's no way that film does well. And if you determined your confidence in a film by its kind of allocated budget, you'd also be skeptical considering that Prestige was given less than a third of what was used for Batman Begins. Well, the early box office tracking, as it's known, predicted much of the same sentiment. The reviews from the first week were also not in the film's favour, leaving both the studio and Nolan himself to go to the premiere of the film thinking that they had failed. And yet, as Nolan notes, it turned out to be the best premiere we'd ever had, because people's expectations were very low. The buzz of the movie was like, they screwed up, the film is a disaster. I actually feel very lucky to have had the experience of what it's like to drive to your premiere knowing that everyone is going to hate your film. And yet, The Prestige went on to make almost 3 times its cost at the box office and, most importantly, is heralded as one of his best films amongst his fans. In fact, I absolutely adore The Prestige, and I think it's one of his most rewatchable films. And you know, this story reminds me of the premiere of Daniel Craig's first outing as James Bond in Casino Royale, which had extremely low expectations, especially from critics coming into it, considering that, you know, the fan favourite Pierce Brosnan had been ousted in what a lot of people thought was going to be a longer film tenure, you know, only to be replaced by a blonde actor who had appeared to have very little physical resemblance to Ian Fleming's character. And yet, upon release, it was clear that the producers, director Martin Campbell and Daniel Craig had seemingly subverted all expectations and created one of the highest reviewed and best performing Bond films ever made. And again, this is a film that's also incredibly rewatchable. But to go back to Nolan, he says, what I learned was it was really important to me that I knew the film was good. Because although it was unpleasant, I knew I liked what I had done. And you realize when the chips are down and everyone turns around and tells you that it's crap, that is all you have. So if you don't believe in it in the first place, you are taking a risk, a terrible risk. And I believe this is the greatest lesson Christopher Nolan has to teach us. The importance of you knowing something is good and about you being your own barometer for taste and trusting that. The phrase trusting the process is probably something you've heard a lot in relation to creating. But when you're a study of great art, you find yourself making something inspired by what you know to be great art, then you should also make your work with confidence, built on trusting your taste. I'm reminded here of a passage in Paul Graham's excellent essay, How to Do Great Work, that reads, "Don't worry if you find you're interested in different things than other people. The stranger your taste in interestingness, the better. The strange tastes are often the strong ones, and a strong taste for work means you'll be productive, and you're more likely to find new things if you're looking where few have ever looked before." And I suppose this is true of all of Nolan's work, not just The Prestige. In preparation for this podcast, I rewatched all of Christopher Nolan's feature films. So if you're curious as to what I think is the best film Christopher Nolan has ever made, I've made a free downloadable PDF in the link in the podcast show notes where I talk about the piece and dissect it. Also, for more on icons, follow at the Icons Pod on Twitter or Icons Podcast on LinkedIn to learn about artists who I don't normally cover in this podcast. And whatever you may find yourself listening to this on, just know that Icons is available across every platform you can think of. That means YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Pocket Casts, and much, much more. So wherever you prefer to listen to your podcasts, please subscribe there and leave us a review if you've enjoyed this episode. And with that, I've been Justin Campbell Platt. This is Icons. Thank you for listening.